In this video, you are going to be rendering the individual expenses to the screen. So right now we have all of the information in the right place. We have the array of expenses. We're just not doing anything meaningful with it. Right now, we're just dumping the length to the screen. Instead, we want to use map to iterate over the array, and we want to render a new instance of an expense list item component for each one. Now I am going to remove the filter from showing up. We don't need that. That was for demonstration purposes only. And the goal is to create a new component. We're going to do that right here. That'll be expense list item.js. And it's actually going to be your job to fill this out. In here, you're going to export a stateless functional component. And this stateless functional component is just going to render a few pieces of information about the individual expense. We're going to render the description. We're also going to render the amount, and finally, we're going to render the created at value. So you don't need to worry about rendering the note, and you don't have to worry about rendering the ID. For now, we're just trying to get some basic information for the individual expenses showing up to the screen. Now, once you do create that stateless functional component that renders the props passed in, you have to actually set that up. If you forget how to do that, remember you're going to use map, you can refer back to the Indecision app code. You can use the exact same techniques we used there to render the individual items to the screen. Now, how do you know you're done? Well, you're done when you are seeing the individual items showing up instead of just the length. So for me, that would be 2. I would have water bill and gas bill. And if I did set up an amount, I would expect the custom amount to show. Otherwise, the default amount and the default created at value will show up instead. So take as much time as you need to get this one done. You have to render many instances of expense list item here, and you have to actually fill out the expense list item component file. Take some time to get this done, pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? I'm going to kick things off by starting off with the component over here. I'm going to create a new const. We'll call this one expense list item, matching up with the file name, and it's going to be a stateless functional component. Right here, we will forget about the props for the moment, and we'll just set up our function. I am going to implicitly return some JSX, and I didn't give you a particular structure for this, so you could have rendered the information however you liked. I'm going to go ahead and create a div, and in here, I'm going to add 2 tags. I will add an h3 tag, and I'll use the description as a text value for that. We'll worry about that in a moment. And down below, I'll add a paragraph tag, and in here, I'll put the amount and created at. We're not worried about formatting any of that stuff for now. We're just going to get it dumped to the screen. So how are we going to get this information? Well, I'm going to have it all passed in on props. So I can destructure that props object and get the individual things off of it. I want description. I want amount. And finally, I would like created at. We now have access to all of this down below. So I'm going to toss the description right inside of here. And down below, I will use a hyphen to separate the 2 values. I'll start off with the amount. I'll toss a space there and a space here, and then I will wrap things up with the created at value. So now that we have the component all set up, we can export it, export default, expense list item, and we're done with this file. We can actually just go ahead and move into the expense list file and focus on that. Now I am going to remove the comments, and I am going to import React since we are using some JSX. Import React from React. Excellent. I'm going to save this file, move over to the expense list component, and the first thing I need to do is import the component I just created. Otherwise, we cannot render it. Importing the default export expense list item, and we're grabbing that from the component file that we just created. So // in the exact same folder right here, expense list item. Now that we have it, we can render it, and that's going to happen with a call to map on the expenses array. Remember, map lets you take in an array of something and get back an array of something else. In our case, we are getting in an array of objects, and we're trying to return an array of instances of expense list item. This is exactly what we did in the Indecision application. Right here, I will pass in my updater function for map. And we know this function takes in the individual item, an individual expense, and we return whatever we want to replace it with. In this case, we want to return some JSX. So I will return an instance of expense list item. Now I do need to pass the data in, and you could have structured this in any way you like. Maybe you actually took expense and tossed it on as a prop like this. Then we would access expense. And this would have changed the code over here for you as well, because you wouldn't have had these items on props. Instead, you would have had props.expense, and that's where these items would have lived. For us though, I'm going to use the spread operator technique we explored previously in this section. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to spread out all of the things on expense. That includes all the properties that we're rendering: description, amount, created at, and others we're not using, note, and ID. Now expense list item has access to all of those, and we are going to be able to destructure them directly off of the props. So if I go ahead and save this, what's the end result? The end result is that we should see over here our expenses showing up. So we have expense list, we have water bill, 0 for both, gas bill, 0 for both. Now you'll notice we are getting an error down below. That's because we haven't provided the key prop, which we know we need. We can set that up. Setting key equal to, and we have a unique value. We have the expense ID. Now if we save the file, once again, things should refresh. The rendered output is exactly the same. The only difference is that we no longer have an error in the console. Now from here, we can take the data in app.js and tweak it. So maybe I add on an amount for the water bill. Right here, amount. Let's say the water bill was $45, so 45, 4,500 cents. I can save the app.js file, and we should see that information over here, and that is exactly what we're getting. So all of the information is getting rendered correctly for the expense list, and this is all I wanted you to do. You didn't need to do anything else to complete the challenge. Now to wrap this video up, what I do want to do is implement our selector. So down below, we have the expenses selector. This is in the expenses.js file. And if you remember, this one takes in the array of expenses and it takes all of the filters and it returns the filtered and sorted array. So this is the one that we're actually going to end up showing to the screen. So currently, for example, if we set a text filter, the data is never going to change because props.expenses comes from state.expenses, which is the complete array. So we're going to need to tweak that just a little bit. Right here, I'm going to import, and we will call the default export select expenses, and we're going to grab this from the file that we just opened up. So we need to go up a directory into the selectors folder. Inside of there, we just have a single file that is indeed the one we want. So we have select expenses imported, and now we can use it down below. So we don't actually need to pass filters into expense list. It doesn't need that information. What we're going to do is remove that, and we're also going to remove the current value for expenses. Instead, we're going to be calling select expenses with the necessary arguments, and we're going to render the return value. So whatever comes back from there, the filtered sorted array, that's what we're going to end up showing to the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done right here by passing in state.expenses. That's the first argument. And the second one is state.filters. Now that we have this in place, we can actually view the filtered list over inside of the browser. You can see right there, I have water bill, and you can see it goes away. Why? Because after 3 seconds, we changed the text filter to rent. So let's go ahead and change it to something like bill instead. That means right away, when it's water, we should just see water bill. Then after 3 seconds, both should show up since both do have bill in their description. I'm going to save the file. We're getting just water bill. 3 seconds later, gas bill shows up as well. So now we have a completely sorted and filtered array of expenses showing up to the screen. The only thing that's really not clear is how do we actually change data? How do I change the filters, for example, from the user interface? We're going to cover that and more in the next video, so stay tuned and I'll see you then.